My wife was mid-shower, her hair thick with suds and half her face covered in foam, when suddenly the water stopped completely. Not just slowed down, it just stopped. She yelled my name like there was an emergency. Slipping on the wet tiles, she scrambled for a towel. I rushed upstairs, expecting maybe she'd spotted a giant spider. Instead, I found her standing there, eyes stinging from the soap, shouting that no water was coming out, not just in the shower, but everywhere. The kitchen sink, the bathroom faucet, even the garden hose dry as a bone. My first thought was a plumbing issue. I headed outside and quickly saw the real problem. Our water line had been cut cleanly and deliberately. A bright orange sign flapped in the breeze, staked into the ground next to our damaged main line. It read, "Unauthorized water access terminated by HOA directive." That's when it hit me. The homeowners association had no clue what kind of storm they just unleashed. Because what they didn't realize was simple but critical. The lake supplying the entire neighborhood's water system of the very same lake they claimed as community property was actually mine. I owned every single drop. I crouched by the severed pipe, the absurdity sinking in. We weren't behind on payments, nor were we stealing water. In fact, we'd never needed their permission at all. Karen Wilbur, the HOA president, had recently gone on a rampage against so-called violations, acting like some kind of self-appointed law enforcer in a tiny neighborhood of fewer than 40 homes and one coffee shop. She'd already fined people for everything from mismatched curtains to garden decorations and even trampolines. But cutting off water without warning, that was a new low. I marched to the HOA office, which was just a converted garage attached to Karen's oversized beige house. The place reeked of self-importance. She sat behind her desk, which was cluttered with at least 3 laminated copies of the HOA charter, sipping tea like suburban royalty. I didn't bother knocking. She looked up with a smirk so sour it could curdle milk. I told her they'd cut my water line. She just nodded like it was some overdue chore she'd finally ticked off her list. Sliding a folder across the desk, she showed me a satellite image highlighting the pipe running from my property to the neighborhood's distribution point. According to her, this was an unauthorized connection. According to me, it was exactly the opposite. I calmly asked if she'd reviewed the county water rights documents before making that call. Her smile faltered for a moment before snapping back like a rubber band. She claimed that everything beyond the HOA lots was communal land, and any water connections needed board approval. That's when I leaned in and dropped the bombshell. "Karen, you're drinking from my lake. The whole community is. You just cut off the only house with legal rights to the water source. Hope your hydrangeas enjoy the drought." She blinked, scoffed, and waved me off as if I was bluffing. I didn't say another word and walked out, but I wasn't bluffing, and she was about to learn it the hard way. Back home, I pulled out old files from my safe. A few years ago, I'd bought a piece of land that came with what most people called a useless pond, but that pond was actually a small natural lake with a deep aquifer beneath it. The HOA had quietly been pumping water from it for years to avoid rising municipal costs. I never charged them or complained since my access was separate, and honestly, I didn't mind. Not until now. A call to my lawyer confirmed everything. The original easement agreement predated the HOA and clearly stated my ownership of the water rights, including control over the supply. It even gave me authority to restrict access if terms were broken, which Karen had just done. The next day, I walked down to the lake's valve station, a small fenced area hidden behind some brush where the HOA pumps connected to the intake lines. I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the system, imagining the chaos if I just shut the valve. But not yet. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd done before they faced the consequences. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done bragging. She posted a triumphant selfie next to the broken pipe on the neighborhood app, declaring, "No more freeloaders. HOA takes water theft seriously." The comments were a mix of applause and confusion. Most people didn't even realize that line was their water source. It was time to clear things up. I posted a sharp photo of my deed to hirees, signed, dated, and stamped by the county clerk with the caption, "Funny thing about lakes, when you own them, you decide who gets to drink." The post blew up in the neighborhood within minutes. Suddenly, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors wanted to know if it was true. Some were furious at Karen, Others worried they'd lose their water too. I told them I wasn't cutting anyone off yet, but if the HOA didn't fix my line and back down, that decision would have to be made. Karen responded with her usual arrogance, accusing me of trying to blackmail the board and threatening to report me to the county. I welcomed it. In fact, I even offered to send her my lawyer's contact, but she declined. That night, as I sat on the porch overlooking the moonlit lake, my wife handed me a glass of wine and asked what my next move was. I told her the shut-off was coming, but not just yet. First, I wanted them to throw a big party, the kind of party that needed tons of water. Because sometimes, you don't just flip the switch off, you let the fools turn on every light in the house, then pull the plug when they're at their most vulnerable. Karen had no idea the fuse was already lit. When the water stopped flowing, it wouldn't be a minor inconvenience. It would be a flood of consequences, a one they'd brought on themselves. The morning after my post went viral in the neighborhood chat, the whole community was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. People were no longer just curious, they were confused, annoyed, and growing increasingly aware that the HOA had stepped into something way bigger than an unauthorized water pipe. From my kitchen window, I watched neighbors walk by the broken pipe, where Karen's little orange stake still stood like a monument to stupidity. One guy even stopped to take a selfie with it, shaking his head. By noon, my inbox was flooded with 30 messages from residents asking if it was true I actually own the lake. I didn't answer them directly. The truth was already leaking faster than the HOA's PR spin could keep up. Meanwhile, Karen stayed silent in the app, unaware that I was already 2 steps ahead. That morning, I met up with Mitch, an old college buddy who now worked as a civil engineer for the county. We met under the guise of catching up, but once we exchanged greetings, I slid over a copy of the deed and easement documents. Mitch scanned them and let out a low whistle. Not only was the HOA's pump station on land I legally controlled, but their main water lines also ran through a path that violated updated environmental codes. That was a juicy bonus I hadn't even expected. He offered to send me a copy of the survey report and noted that if I wanted to restrict or shut off access, the county wouldn't stop me unless there was an emergency. Given the HOA's arrogance, Mitch doubted one would come from their side. Later that day, I walked down to the pump station. Nothing fancy, just a fenced-off area with a couple of pumps feeding into the main line that branched out to the neighborhood. I had the only master valve key. Technically, I didn't need it to shut things off if there was a cut-off upstream, but holding that solid chunk of brass in my hand felt like holding their fate. I wasn't ready to twist it yet. Timing was everything. Back home, I sketched out a simple plan: shut off the flow not when they expected it, but when they needed it most. Not just to make a point, but to let the consequences echo. They needed to feel it, not just see it. If I shut their water off immediately after the pipe was cut, Karen would spin it as retaliation. But if I waited to let her stage something big, she'd bury herself in her own foolishness. My chance came sooner than I expected. That evening, Karen posted a smug announcement. The HOA was hosting a summer kickoff celebration that Saturday. Food trucks, a water balloon fight, dunk tanks, and a children's inflatable water slide. The whole event was built on the assumption that water would flow freely. I nearly choked on my drink reading it. I couldn't have scripted it better myself. It was like she handed me a script and begged me to pull the plug right as the dunk tank lever dropped. Friday night, I walked the lake's perimeter just after dusk. The air was still, the lake shimmering under the moonlight. I stopped at the control box, an old steel cabinet near the inlet where the hose pipe branched from the main line. I had installed a timer system that could be remotely activated. Exactly at 1 p.m. on Saturday, the valve would close, and water to the neighborhood would stop dead. Their emergency systems would still get minimal flow that was critical in case of any real emergency, but all lawn sprinklers, outdoor spigots, and even indoor plumbing tied to the secondary lines would go dry. I wasn't leaving them in danger, just deep, embarrassing discomfort. Saturday arrived hot and bright, a perfect weather for a summer bash. I set up a lawn chair in my front yard and sipped lemonade, watching cars roll into the community park just 2 streets down. Kids ran past, armed with pool noodles and water balloons. 2 giant inflatable slides towered over the grass like colorful beacons. I had to admit, The setup was impressive, the kind of event that needed water like lungs needed air. Karen strutted around like she was the mayor of a small town, beaming at parents, directing the DJ, and barking orders at the local taco truck guy like she owned the place. A few neighbors noticed me and waved hesitantly, not sure if I was the villain or the hero yet. That was about to change. Exactly at 1 p.m., I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. I counted slowly. At midnight, the first signs appeared in my mind before anyone else noticed. The dunk tank sputtered and failed to fill. Moments later, a mom shouted from the water slide line that the spray jets had stopped working. Kids slipped and slid on the scorching vinyl, frustrated and crying as they lost momentum halfway down. Balloon refill stations ran completely dry, and the DJ's microphone cut out mid-announcement when the cooling fans shut off. What began as confusion quickly turned into panic as residents started receiving texts from home. Sinks and toilets had stopped working, too. Karen's expression was priceless. One moment she was glowing with pride, the next she frowned at the empty dunk tank and hurried over to a growing crowd at the now-bone-dry slide. People demanded answers. Some blamed the city, others pointed fingers at me. I sat back calmly in my lawn chair, sipping lemonade like I was watching a suspenseful show unfold in real time. Then came the final blow. The fire marshal, a resident of the neighborhood, stepped in and asked what contingency plans were in place for this sudden water outage. Karen faltered, tried to call the pump operator only to realize the HOA didn't have one. They'd just been flipping switches and hoping nature would take care of the rest. When the confusion hit its peak, I stood and walked over, and not raising my voice, not gloating, I simply announced loud enough for everyone to hear that their water had been legally shut off by the owner of the lake. I held up a laminated copy of the deed like a magician revealing the final card. The silence was deafening. A woman near the taco truck gasped. A kid dropped his half-filled balloon. Karen's mouth opened and closed without a sound. I offered to restore water access, but only if the HOA repaired the severed pipe, issued a formal apology, and publicly acknowledged my ownership of the lake. I gave them 24 hours to respond, then turned and walked away. A man near the grill shouted that someone should get Karen out of charge before she turned the whole town into a desert. Back on my porch, I sat down and waited. The ball was in their court, but judging by their faces, they were holding a deflated Onia and the court had turned to cracked concrete. Sunday morning arrived with an uncomfortable silence that's rare in a neighborhood this size. No sprinklers clicking on, no air conditioning humming, no children splashing in hoses. It felt as if the entire community had been dunked into confusion and left out to dry in the sun. The HOA group chat was a battlefield. Some residents demanded Karen's immediate resignation, others asked if they needed to boil rainwater, and at least two accused me of eco-terrorism. But no one could dispute that I'd done nothing illegal. Every step I took was fully within my rights, well documented, and legally protected. The real issue wasn't water anymore. It was authority, and Karen was bleeding it out minute by minute. Desperate, she posted a long message in the app, accusing me of weaponizing natural resources and calling me a menace to community harmony. She claimed I lied about ownership, insisted the lake was shared, and accused me of forging documents, especially ironic since the county water department had already verified everything. Clearly, she wasn't trying to convince me. She was clinging to power by trying to sway the undecided, but the fence was crumbling beneath her. By noon, I got a call from Officer Delgado, a local sheriff's deputy who'd patrolled the area for years. He was laughing. Apparently, Karen had stormed into the sheriff's office demanding I be arrested for public endangerment and hostile control of utilities. The sheriff had calmly reviewed my documents submitted weeks ago when I first discovered the HOA rerouting water through my land, and even pulled out a printed copy of the easement termination clause. Delgado told me the sheriff had politely informed Karen that if she pushed the issue, she could be the one facing legal consequences, possibly even charges for tampering with private infrastructure. After they cut my pipe, she'd stormed out yelling about calling the governor. That part made me laugh out loud. But things took a darker turn that night, around 9:30 p.m., when my motion cameras triggered an alert near the lake. At first, I thought the motion sensor had been triggered by wildlife, but when I checked the footage, my jaw clenched. A man in a dark hoodie was sneaking through the fence near the valve station. He pulled out a pair of bolt cutters and clumsily began working on the lock. Nervously glancing over his shoulder, I zoomed in just as he looked up toward one of the hidden cameras. It was Todd Wilbur, Karen's brother-in-law, the same guy who'd tried to run an unlicensed lawn care business and once accidentally sprayed weed killer on a neighbor's vegetable garden. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Delgado arrived within 10 minutes and caught Todd red-handed, still fiddling with the locked control box. I met them at the edge of the lake, where Todd sat handcuffed on a folding chair, muttering something about just trying to help the community. Karen showed up shortly after, clearly tipped off. She tried to distance herself, claiming Todd was acting alone, but Todd had already told Delgado that Karen had encouraged him to fix things before the Monday board meeting. Delgado took statements from both of them. Todd was released pending charges, but Karen was officially warned. Her reputation was unraveling fast. Within hours, someone leaked the camera footage to the community group. I had nothing to do with it, but I wasn't losing sleep over that. The video showed everything: Todd sneaking in, tampering with the pipes, and then getting hauled away in front of my motion-activated floodlights. The caption read, "HOA water crisis escalates, a attempted sabotage caught on camera." By morning, local news vans were parked outside the HOA office. A reporter delivered a live update titled "Lake Owner Locks Out HOA. Water Rights Dispute Makes Waves." Karen tried to schedule a closed-door emergency home meeting, but several board members refused to attend unless it was open to the entire community. That was the beginning of her downfall. I decided to attend. I didn't have to, but I wanted to witness her unraveling firsthand. The meeting took place in the community hall, a converted storage building with cheap folding chairs and a whining sound system that buzzed every time someone moved the microphone. I walked into a mix of stares and murmurs. Some people glared, others nodded, and a few whispered thanks. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her voice strained as she tried to call the meeting to order. She opened with a speech about unity and miscommunication, painting herself as a misunderstood leader trying to do what was best for everyone. Then she turned the focus back to me, accusing me again of manipulating the system, hoarding water, and refusing to be a team player. When she paused for breath, I calmly asked for the mic. I stepped forward, holding out a stack of documents. I read aloud the county's official letter confirming my ownership and easement rights. Then I listed the violation codes she'd broken by tampering with my property. Finally, I played the camera footage on a small projector I'd brought, just in case anyone still doubted. When the clip ended with Todd's grimacing face frozen on the screen, the room fell silent. Then someone in the back let out a loud chuckle. It was contagious. Soon, the entire room buzzed with laughter, murmurs, and the quiet sound of Karen's power slipping away. One board member stood and made it official. A motion to remove Karen as HOA president was proposed and seconded. Within 30 seconds, the vote was overwhelming. Karen stood frozen, mouth twitching as she tried to process it. Someone yelled she should apologize. Another said she owed residents for the party disaster. She didn't speak. She simply turned and left, clutching her clipboard like a shield that had already failed. After the meeting, I was approached by Helena, the soft-spoken interim president who'd always remained neutral. She apologized for the HOA's actions, promised they'd cover the cost of repairing the pipe, and asked if I'd consider restoring water service. I nodded and told her the valve would be reopened by nightfall. But I added one more thing: I'd be drafting a new agreement, one that acknowledged the lake's ownership, formalized water usage terms, and ensured this never happened again. She agreed immediately. As I walked home, the air felt lighter, not just because the water was about to flow again, but because Karen's grip on the neighborhood had finally snapped. It only took one pipe, one lake, and one patient man with a plan. That evening, when I reopened the valve, the pressure in the main line hissed like a tire dragon waking from a forced nap. I watched the gauges stabilize and stepped back as the system hummed back to life, silently sending water through the buried pipes to every home that had been dry for 36 hours. Lights blinked on, pumps whirred steadily, lawn sprinklers resumed their gentle clicks, hoses sputtered to life, and a few windows lit up with cheers from kids finally able to refill their pools. But even with the water flowing, the story was far from over. This wasn't just a plumbing issue or HOA drama anymore. It had turned into a public spectacle spiraling beyond our small lakeside community. The next morning, a second news van arrived, this time from a regional network. A reporter stood outside the HOA office, asking residents if they knew their water had been running through private property all along. One man, still in pajama pants, said he just wanted to water his tomatoes without ending up in a legal battle. Another woman, more enthusiastic, said she hoped the HOA finally learned what accountability meant. Meanwhile, Karen's face was now the star of a viral meme circulating local forums. A freeze frame from the dunk tank party showed her fuming next to the dry slide while kids wailed in the background. The caption read, "When you cut the pipe but forget who owns the lake." It spread like wildfire and I didn't have to lift a finger. The interim HOA board wasted no time. They issued a formal apology, not just in the group app, but with printed letters slid under every door. They acknowledged my ownership, admitted to unlawfully severing the pipe, and promised structural changes in how future decisions would be made. Most importantly, they included a clause stating that any infrastructure connected to private property would require direct owner consent going forward. That one sentence was worth more than a dozen court rulings. I even had it framed in my office. Still, something felt off. Karen had gone radio silent since her removal. She vanished from every group, thread, and meeting. Todd pleaded guilty to misdemeanor trespassing, got hit with a hefty fine and suspended sentence. But Karina Brokenbar Karen hadn't been charged yet, which struck me as odd. Someone who had fought so fiercely for control didn't just disappear without a trace. I had a gut feeling she wasn't done yet, and that hunch was right. The following Thursday, I received a certified letter from her lawyer. It was a civil notice. Karen was suing me for defamation, loss of community standing, and personal damages tied to what she called malicious water manipulation. The claim was absurd enough to be almost funny. According to the letter, I had weaponized my ownership of a natural resource to target her, caused emotional distress, and orchestrated intentional public humiliation. I laughed for a solid minute before calling my lawyer, who sounded even more amused. But we took it seriously. He drafted a detailed rebuttal, attaching every county approval, ownership certificate, easement document, and video timestamp showing Karen and Todd's violations. We sent it to her attorney with a clear warning: if they proceeded, we would countersue for property damage, trespassing, and defamation. The package included witness statements from the board meeting and the sheriff's incident report. The case never made it to court. 2 days later, Karen's lawyer quietly withdrew the complaint. I can only imagine that conversation of realizing she was trying to sue the one guy who had all the proof and the media on his side. That probably didn't go well. Around the same time, the HOA held a town hall meeting to start rebuilding trust. They invited me to speak, and I agreed, not out of pride, but because people needed to hear the truth. It wasn't just about one woman cutting a pipe. It was about the dangers of unchecked power. Standing before a packed room, I explained that I never intended to weaponize anything. The water line had been undisturbed for years until someone tried to control what wasn't theirs. Heads nodded, a few faces showed embarrassment, and some people quietly apologized to those who had once supported Karen. It wasn't a victory speech, but a reality check, and most appreciated the honesty. To prevent a repeat, I met with the new board to draft a clear water usage agreement. It spelled out exactly how much water could be drawn, for what purposes, who maintained the infrastructure, and protocols for resolving disputes. The agreement was official, signed by both sides, and filed with the county. No loopholes, no gray areas. I even added a clause requiring a 30-day written notice before any physical changes to shared lines. They agreed immediately. With stability returning, I took one last step toward closure. I hired a landscaping company to install a modest but elegant fountain in front of the HOA office. At its base, a bronze plaque read, "Water is a shared gift. Respect the source." Most people smiled when they saw it. Some even laughed, but Karen was nowhere to be found. Then, about 3 weeks after the incident, a white sedan pulled up to my house. A delivery driver handed me a padded envelope. Inside was a postcard and no return address, just a sunset photo and a short message, written in cramped handwriting: "Enjoy your lake. Lord of the Pipes. I've moved on to where people know who's in charge. I flipped it over. It was signed, begrudgingly, with ink. I stared at it a moment, then walked down to the lake's edge and skimmed a pebble across the water. Karen might have thought this was about control, but she never understood that it was really about responsibility. Owning something doesn't mean ruling over others. It means knowing where to draw the line, and what to do when someone crosses it. With the sun setting over my lake and the distant hum of neighbors finally living in peace, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. Not because I'd won, but because I'd fixed what was broken quietly, legally, and without raising my voice. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing which valve to turn, and when. Summer settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that makes you forget how wild things had been just weeks before. Lawns turned green, kids rode bikes without dodging potholes or angry HOA enforcers, and the neighborhood felt like a community and not a battlefield. With Karen gone and the new board acting like neighbors instead of tyrants, people breathed easier. But I wasn't about to let the past wash away completely. Some things needed to be stronger than before. I wasn't about to let that Lakia or the power it represented become a target again. That meant locking in every lesson, making sure the water flowed with purpose, not politics. One of my first moves was filing revised easement protections with the county. These went beyond simple usage rules to include emergency protocols, infrastructure repairs, and jurisdiction boundaries. These new protections meant no HOA, present or future, could pull what Karen did without triggering serious consequences. I also set up tiered water access levels linked to neighborhood cooperation. If the board ever slipped back into chaos, I could limit their secondary water use without affecting the residents' primary needs. Some called it overkill, I called it smart insurance. But legal armor wasn't enough. I wanted the message to be cultural, to shape how people thought about the lake. So I started organizing monthly lake cleanups, community picnics, and educational events. What began as a few curious families quickly grew into a lively community event. Kids arrived with nets and buckets, eager to pick up trash and learn about how runoff affected fish. Parents brought snacks, volunteers set up music, and the lake gradually became more than just a utility. It became a source of pride. It shifted from mere background scenery to something everyone wanted to protect. That's when I realized something important. Karen's attempt to weaponize the HOA's authority had failed, but in doing so, it forced everyone to pick a side. It exposed how many people had quietly tolerated the HOA's nonsense just to avoid conflict. With that fear lifted, people started speaking up, questioning illogical rules, and holding their leaders accountable. A woman who'd once been fined for painting her mailbox blue now led the communications committee. A single dad, previously cited for patio furniture violations, began hosting weekend barbecues open to all. It felt like the community had remembered it was allowed to enjoy itself. Still, not all wounds were healed. One afternoon, while adjusting irrigation sensors by the lake, I spotted two teenagers sneaking along the trail near the old pump shed. They weren't causing trouble, just curious. I called out, and they froze, wide-eyed. I waved them over and explained how the pump worked, how the system supplied the neighborhood, and why it had once been a battleground. They listened closely, then asked the question I expected. Did I really shut off the water during a party just to prove a point? I laughed and said, no, I shut it off because someone broke the rules. When people mess with what they don't understand, consequences tend to show up holding a wrench. After they left, I sat quietly, thinking how easily everything could have spiraled out of control if I'd acted impulsively or lacked the proper documents. It could have become an expensive legal nightmare or worse. Instead, the truth had carried all the weight. Karen thought authority was about control, but she forgot it comes with responsibility and respect. That was her downfall. Even she eventually accepted the outcome, at least on the surface. Last I heard, she'd moved to a stricter HOA community 2 counties away, one with busy residents who didn't have time for her antics. Apparently, she even tried running for the board 3 and lost by a landslide. The final chapter came unexpectedly a few months later. Life was back to normal when I received a letter, not a complaint or threat, but a formal invitation. The Regional Homeowners Association conference wanted me to speak on a panel about infrastructure ownership and conflict resolution. At first, I laughed at me, a speaker, but the more I thought about it, the more I saw it as a chance to share a story most people never hear until it's too late. The panel was held in a large convention center filled with the usual suspects, board members, suburban planners, and wide-eyed new homeowners wondering what they'd gotten into. I laid it all out at a pipe: the lake, the shutdown, the dunk tank meltdown, no sugarcoating. I explained how quickly things fall apart when egos outrun empathy, and how the best solution wasn't lawsuits but community block parties and fountains. The crowd actually applauded. Afterwards, people asked questions, shared their own horror stories, and some even said they wished someone like me lived in their neighborhood. I wasn't a hero, just a guy who said enough. When I got home, the neighborhood had left me a surprise: a handmade sign near the lake's entrance, painted by one of the local kids. It was a little crooked but full of heart. It read, "Welcome to Peace Lake, take only what you need, give back what you can." I stood there reading those words over and over. That message wasn't mine, but it might be the best summary of everything that happened. It wasn't just about water, it was about principles, resources, respect, and responsibility. I never wanted to be the guy holding the entire community's water supply in his hands, but when they pushed me there, I chose fairness over ruthlessness. That choice kept me sane through the chaos, and it changed the neighborhood more than any pipe or valve ever could. In the end, all I really wanted was to be left alone to enjoy my home and my lake. But when challenged, I didn't just defend it, I made sure it would never need defending again. Now, when I walk the shoreline in the evening, the water is calm, the pumps hum quietly, and the people are content. The distant sound of sprinklers, the laughter of children, and the gentle ripple of the lake have replaced arguments, threats, and dry faucets. The war over water is long over, but the legacy of what we built together is just beginning. And it all started with one reckless decision, one silent lake, and one man who refused to be bullied by a plastic sign and a clip-on badge.